effectively today, we're going to go ahead and lecture some more. The lab is occlusion. It's pretty simple. You can see my lack of enthusiasm for doing it. And hopefully you guys can count reps and realize it turns out you can do a lot more on the non-occluded limb than on your occluded, but that's something that you can do at home. If you've got like an ACE bandage or something along those lines, obviously something that's elastic, and you want to wrap it tight enough that if it's like a scale from 1 to 10, like 10 is someone who's just your complete corpse hand, like there's no perfusion, you're turning purple and then white, that's too tight. And then 1 is like, a rubber band that can barely hold on, like super weak. You want it to be about a 7. So the idea is we're still allowing the systolic blood flow to the area, but we're not really getting much diastolic return. So because of that, all of the metabolites are accumulating and you're not able to get a lot of nutrient turnover, much less to obviously get the pH to drop down. So it causes an increase in localized growth factors. And holy cow, guys, it is super uncomfortable. Not a fan of performing it, but the research of application of BFR in recovery models, specifically individuals coming back from injury, is really, really interesting. We've done obviously some of that at EKU, and they have a much nicer system, one that actually regulates blood pressure in those cuffs specifically to what it should be. So you're not going to be too high or too low on the pressure. It auto regulates, whereas when you put on the straps, there's some issues there. But that's obviously how you guys can do it on your own, and you don't even need to watch. You can watch the video to see how I kind of set it up and how I do it, but then you can go ahead and run that on your own. So if you don't have any questions on that for the lab, next week, the goal is to do something that is kind of a choose our own adventure. So something that you guys want to go ahead and do a lab on, and obviously we are very limited on equipment overall. So if there's anything that you guys can think of that you can perform at home and we can make that the final lab, this is an open conversation. So you guys can throw up any ideas that you've got in the chat, or unmute yourself and we can kind of talk through something that's feasible that everybody can do at home. And then we'll use like a Google Doc, like Google Excel, or like the partner training one that I've got you, I gave you guys access to, that you guys can just enter your data there and then, roll with it. So anyone have any thoughts on anything they'd like to do?
Can you give us some ideas on what we would be testing?
Well, really anything. It could be something like you guys just do a step test at home. So you're just literally, doing however many steps you can with, say, looking at that heart rate, so kind of like the YMCA step test. And then we could do something like maybe burpees, because that sounds absolutely horrible. And figure out, like max reps that you can do in X amount of time, and then trying to relate that to the metabolic performance of the step test. And so everybody could kind of enter their own data, like, how many burpees could you do in like 2 or 3 minutes, something that's going to be kind of like a critical power test and just obviously horrendous. And then, take your pulse pre-post and then do that step test pre-post, where you can find the cadence for that online pretty easy. And if you have access to a treadmill where you're at, you obviously could always rerun your Bruce submax and get an idea of your VO2 max from there. And once again, we kind of try to relate it to that burpee performance.
At all costs, I'm going to steer clear from the burpees.
Oh, no, I mean, they suck. It's not exactly a fun exercise to do, but I was just trying to think of something that, once again, you guys could try and take care of at home and look at performance. We could do reaction time via what's known as a ruler drop. So effectively, you have your hand sitting there on a table, you have a ruler, somebody drops it, you catch it, and then effectively, it falls at whatever, well, it falls at that 9.81 meters per second squared of acceleration. So the further it falls, the more time it took you to grab. And while you guys are home, you guys could do a bunch of trials, figure out, what was your average reaction time, and then try to do the same thing only after you've had some coffee, Try to do the same thing maybe when you first get up in the morning and look at the effects of, literally just not being awake enough for it and how that influences reaction time. There's a lot of different things that we can still test at home, given very limited amount of equipment. But at the same time, trying to think of what you guys can do that, everybody in theory should be able to hop in on. So burpees for time, Gracie, sounds like the final choice.
I mean, if no one else has anything better.
Burpees for time.
Jake, you would, just because I said that I didn't want to.
Let's go.
All right, sounds good. Unless somebody comes up with a better modality, then yeah, I'll go ahead and start kind of writing that up and put that up there for you guys. And the goal is, like I said, do some type of simple step test, and then look at what we figure your VO2 is going to be estimated, then compare it to how many burpees you can bang out in a minute, and then try to look and see how those two correlate. Yeah, this is gonna be really awful. I like it.
I like the ruler one.
Oh, the reaction time test sounds like a better test now.
Yep.
Go figure.
Burpees.
Well, like anything else, just go ahead, since, this is the problem with democracies, guys, when most people don't show up and they don't vote and deal with what comes up here. And so since currently I only see 7 of you guys, go ahead and just throw up in the chat, you can either write burpees or we'll say, reaction time. And whoever has the majority, that's going to be the lab that you guys are going to be doing. It would be great if some of the people here aren't even anywhere near.
Damn, it's 2-2.
Yeah, once again, there's 7 of you, and we still have yet to hear anything from. Oh, there we go. There we go. Wow, Gracie, way to be the bigger person there. And so, Jake, whenever you get back to your Blanton, unless he's away from keyboard. Oh, nice. It's going to be okay, Gracie. Just throwing yourself at the ground and then getting back up. So I'll work on writing that up and posting it up later on, so you guys are going to be able to do that. So, hey, we're not trying to be spiteful here, folks, but the basic premise is we'll have you do like a YMCA step test, or you can do a Bruce Submax test on the treadmill if you have a treadmill at home and can obviously mimic it. And then from there, or if you can still find your Bruce Submax data previously, you can just go ahead and use that, even though we know some people end up with some crazy numbers. So probably just end up with a step test. And then it's going to be, 3 minutes banging out however many burpees you can. And then we'll have you guys putting that into Excel and figuring out what your...
I thought you said 1 minute.
Oh, you just want to do 1 minute, Jake? But that's not really aerobic. That's still hitting your anaerobic system. Remember,
Right.
once we get over that 2 minute hump, that's when the aerobic side. So this is a critical power test.
All right.
Just a few minutes ago where you were super enthusiastic for this, and then I said 3 minutes of burpees, and all of a sudden we backed off.
I thought it was gonna be 1 minute. I was like,
see, this is where you start eating your words.
I'll stay in my word.
Okay, all right. Sounds good. So we're gonna have some fun. Any questions about drug use, ergogenic aids, the placebo effect, the nocebo effect that I talked about last time before we take off going through discussing some effectively some more physiological agents? Anything else you guys want me to touch on? Okay, well,
We're good.
the next components that we're going into is what's known as physiological agents. Now, these are things that occur naturally in our own body that we can use for performance. Now, When it comes to physiological agents, we can be talking about things like blood doping, which is illegal in most competitions. We've got then changes in our natural erythropoietin production, which we can do both legally and illegally, but both give us effectively the same response. Along with, we can talk about wasting money and time on things like oxygen supplementation, and then utilizing bicarbonate loading for anaerobic performance, and then phosphate loading, which really doesn't seem to help at all. So, what is blood doping? Well, it turns out blood doping is effectively trying to increase your red blood cell count. Remember, that's a natural effect of aerobic style training, but this is massively exploiting it. So the way that it's typically done is usually about 1 to 2 months before competition. An athlete is going to have about a pint or even possibly 2 pints of blood taken out of them. That's going to be stored in a refrigerator, and then it's going to be reinfused into them literally just for effectively that 1 day to 1 week pre-competition, so that the way they're going to massively increase their blood's red or oxygen carrying capacity, which in turn is going to enhance aerobic performance. The issue with this is it's also increasing your hematocrit, which in turn is making your blood more viscous, which then actually makes it harder for your body to pump it around your body, and you have an increased risk of literally dying of things like heart attacks and strokes. In fact, some young Tour de France athletes in the past have died because of this. And what's really entertaining is on occasion they really screw it up and they mix the wrong blood in the wrong bags. But that's a different thing entirely. That's how 2 cyclists pop positive, not because they were detected for doing anything wrong, but because they literally mixed the bags. But thankfully their ABO, blood type was close enough that they were fine and didn't have a reaction. But I believe it was actually their Kell antibodies that were different. So they're like, you realize you have 2 different people's blood in you, and you haven't been in a traumatic accident recently, so you busted. Now, what this is going to do is, once again, give us a great advantage, because when we give ourselves that about month or more after donating, we're naturally bringing our red blood cell levels back up to where they were before donating blood. And then we throw in the old blood on top of it and we get this supercharged effect. So it is great for aerobic athletes, specifically long duration. So this is something that Tour de France athletes have been known to do, along with abusing erythropoietin and other drugs to increase red blood cell production. But also it's been seen in some marathoners, Ironmen, and other distance athletes. So, like I said, we can have some major issues with it. That's why sports will test your hematocrit level. And if it's too high, you're not allowed to compete, because they're assuming that you are cheating. And once again, increasing your risk. And of course, you do have to venipuncture, both to get the blood out and put it back in. And that obviously has a little bit of issues with getting infections and or some type of transfer disease if you're not doing things appropriately. So as far as medical risks far outweigh the potential benefits, the risks really aren't that high when you're using it with really high level athletes. This once again is fear mongering, because it's easier than having a really uncomfortable conversation about how sports are relatively absurd hobbies that we like to have, and that we get really pretentious about, which brain damage ball team beats the other brain damage ball team. But at the end of the day, you obviously can risk death in otherwise healthy individuals. That would never be a possibility. But these are also athletes that are incredibly, specifically in the Tour de France state, small individuals moving at incredibly high speeds with flimsy little helmets. So they've already made some decisions where they're they're comfortable with being on the edge of letting go of that mortal coil than your average individual. But at the same time, it's just like anything else. Just to be intelligent about what are the real risks of what am I doing, and is it really that useful? Now, erythropoietin, the hormone that we've talked about before that our kidneys produce when they're not getting enough oxygen, that tells our bone marrow to start producing more red blood cells. It's completely normal, and we increase the amount of that when we do a lot of aerobic training, because it turns out our kidneys are under fueled with oxygen for a little while, and that's their own natural defense mechanism, because it tends to be also a decent global proxy for the rest of the body. Now, once we go and we take erythropoietin, it gives us the same effects as blood doping, but the key is we don't have to go through venipuncture. I believe erythropoietin is injected, it's either subcutaneous. I'm not sure if it's intramuscular or if it's adipose, but it's definitely one of those hormones you've got to inject yourself with in order to have that effect. And it's going to give us effectively the same positive effects, but also giving us a lot of the exact same risks when it comes to the negative outcomes. And so like Lance Armstrong and a lot of those Tour de France competitors utilize this substance along with a lot of analogs to it, because for the longest time, there wasn't even a drug test for it. Now, when we talk about using erythropoietin, and even when we talk about using things like testosterone, using things like growth hormone, it's very important that we have a true concept of which is how much do you really gain. And I know I've talked about this beforehand. What you're typically seeing with some of those perfusion studies with using erythropoietin and otherwise is you're really going to be looking at maybe increasing your performance by as much as 10%. And so hence, all of this drug use is really only useful if you're already pretty darn good. If you're not that good of an athlete in the first place, it is going to make you better, but you're going to go from, awful to, well, you still suck. You're not going to be going from awful to great. You're going to maybe move yourself up, not necessarily a full letter grade, so to speak, in performance, but maybe go from a minus to a normal letter to maybe a plus. You're not going to go from being a D-level athlete to an A-level athlete. And therein lies the problem, is you get a lot of people that will utilize not just these substances, but utilize them excessively without having good medical controls. Because Lance Armstrong was the most heavily drug tested athlete of all time, never failed a single drug test, because he had an entire group of people behind him helping him get these drugs of good quality, utilize these drugs appropriately, and specifically in ways in which he could beat the testing. So this is a very well-funded operation, whereas you guys probably know some bro at the rec center that's injecting God knows what. Well, back when we could go wreck ourselves. Oh, nope, still don't miss the rec center. So they could be a little bit more swole, but who knows if what they're getting has purity? Who knows how much they're taking? Are they tracking their blood biomarkers on top of that? Are they staying on top of their blood pressure, the resting heart rate? All of those other good indicators of, hey, are we recovering appropriately? Are we healthy? What's going on? Now, we then have oxygen supplementation, the idea that we can use a little bit more oxygen to increase performance. It doesn't really seem to help that much. You might be able to get a little bit more performance. What's interesting about the oxygen supplementation, in fact, there's a little bit of potential applications of actually working out in a hypoxic environment, so a little bit low oxygen. So it's even more stressful cardiovascularly and a little bit pulmonary for you because you're not able to get as much oxygen per breath. And then other parts where you effectively supercharge it. So then the limiting factor becomes the exercising muscle, not your cardiovascular system. So it's not really that useful, so to speak, as a way to increase performance, but at the same time, it is typically pretty expensive to go ahead and set up and utilize, so you're not really going to see this too much. Hyperbaric chambers are fascinating. That's where you're literally going to stay inside of a smaller chamber. It's usually like at a size of like a twin bed inside, that you're going to be breathing the equivalent of air that's in a much higher atmosphere. And there's some potential uses for it in anything from brain injuries to individuals with some types of chronic wounds, or not chronic, but severe wounds, and trying to get faster recovery. But unfortunately, it's one of those areas of research that's a little bit more difficult to do, because it requires people to be inside of either soft shell or hard shell hyperbaric chambers. And oh, there's a bunny outside. Oh, that's cute. Get out there, Hessel. So you can utilize, or you should be at least be aware that that's something that can be utilized in certain demographics, but at the same time, it's not something that's easily accessible and might be worth just having on the radar. Now there's bicarbonate loading. This is actually something that we did, or I did, for my master's thesis, which is gave folks sodium bicarbonate and looked at its effects on anaerobic sprinting performance. And in reality, it does seem to help. The problem is is sodium bicarbonate. What's another term for sodium bicarbonate, specifically if you're in the kitchen? What do we typically refer to sodium bicarbonate as?
Baking soda.
Yeah, it's baking soda, Tori. Now, how many of you guys ever had the person that just phoned it in for the elementary school science fair and made a volcano? Or you've maybe seen it on TV.
I definitely
for
done
sure
that.
everyone has.
Okay. Now, what are you combining in order to make that volcano?
Vinegar,
Good. Vinegar and
baking soda.
there you go. Now, baking soda, its pH is what? Is it acidic or is it basic? Let me just keep it simple.
Basic.
There you go. And when you combine that with an acid, what happens?
A reaction.
Yes, a reaction where you're going to have, it's their equivalent. Yes, a boom. Now the question is for you guys, okay, so you're taking sodium bicarbonate, baking soda. After you swallow it, where does it go?
Into your stomach.
Bingo. And what's the pH of your stomach? Approximately.
Very acidic.
So how do you think that volcano feels inside of your GI?
Not good.
The answer there being not good, because I did it to myself and a myriad of other people that were kind enough to participate in my thesis. And so hence the problem is it definitely can cause GI discomfort. And a other less than well advertised effect of excessive sodium bicarbonate supplementation, aside from the bloating and cramping, is what, honey? Diarrhea. So it does help with anaerobic performance. It will help you buffer that lactate for a little bit longer so you can perform at a much higher intensity. However, it also is a potent laxative. So there is some more recent research in which you're not going to give somebody that massive 300 mg per kilogram bolus before they're going to compete. Instead, it's you slowly have them supplement it for like a day or two beforehand in order to optimize those levels. And it seems to give you far less of the downsides with the GI distress. But at the same time, it's not something that's enhancing performance too much. But if you've got somebody that's like a 400-meter runner, an 800-meter runner, where they're just living and dominating and having to go 100% in those energy systems, it might be something potentially to look into. Now, in theory, phosphate loading can help you in that you're going to be able to increase the total amount of phosphate available for both phosphorylating creatine and for helping you completely replenish your ATP levels. But it doesn't really seem to really help that much. So it doesn't really have also that much of a negative effect, but it's one of those situations where you're probably just better off eating a normal healthy diet because there's already enough phosphate typically in a mixed diet that you don't really need to supplement with it exogenously. Now, you guys have probably seen a number of different amino acids being utilized in theory to help with performance. Tryptophan has been investigated a little bit in its ability to decrease pain and fatigue, but it doesn't really help at all with performance. The idea is tryptophan accumulation inside of the brain also causes the onset of fatigue. So the argument there is to use BCAAs as a competitor. Doesn't really have any effect also with delaying fatigue, but this is looking at more aerobic performance. BCAAs is probably a little bit more useful for helping avoid muscle catabolism, so breakdown when you're doing really hard aerobic training. Tryptophan may be slightly useful for increasing serotonin production, so taking a bolus of this before you go to bed might be useful if you're having a hard time sleeping. And leucine, which is one of the metabolites of breaking down the branched-chain amino acid, the branched-chain amino acid, which is leucine, HMB actually has shown to have really good effects on lowering muscle catabolism in older individuals, and I'm talking about the elderly. And whereas the use in younger individuals doesn't really seem to be that efficacious. So I personally would suggest not spending your money on it. There's acetyl L-Carnitine, which is going to be arguably a little bit useful with fat metabolism, but that's only if it's a rate limiter. You see that in energy drinks a lot, but it doesn't really seem to have a whole lot of use. It's just something that's relatively cheap and makes other people feel like they're getting something better. It was entertaining because I was walking through Costco and I saw the white cans of Monster and immediately thought of Jared and Hadley, but of course they didn't show up for Zoom class today. I guess because they didn't have their palette of Monster energy drinks. Now, creatine is hands down one of the most investigated supplements ever. It is pretty damn useful. It works. It helps increase your anaerobic performance, specifically very, very short performance, can help you increase your general overall strength performance. Now that's over time. Creatine is one of those that you have to take chronically to really have its full effect. But you don't necessarily need to take creatine if you're able to eat a diet that's heavy in red meat, specifically more of the wild meat than the store-bought, specifically more sedentary meat. And it does help with performance. We're still talking about only adding a couple percentage points. We're not talking about you're going to double or triple or quadruple your gains. And so that's the important things to keep in mind. It does have not just important effects on your muscular system, but it's also important in your nervous system. And in fact, supplementing with it seems to have a slight prophylactic effect, meaning avoidance of literally worse outcomes with things like a concussion. So as far as I'm concerned, nearly every single athlete should be on creatine. The only ones that shouldn't are ones that where they're playing a sport that's very important for them to keep that body weight relative power up, or they're a weight class athlete. So what that means is if you're a long distance runner, your ATP PCR system is rarely a limiting factor, if ever. So it's also going to make you heavier because of a little bit of water retaining you're going to have. But obviously for you guys that play baseball, play softball out here, and then, Jake Blanton, who, I wouldn't ever use the term plays soldier because that's obviously inaccurate. Whatever we call that military operation, because I don't know the correct term.
Just ROTC, just what their PT sessions, stuff of that matter. That's all we're really doing right now.
Yeah. So, for your demands, for like the long distance running aspect of the military, arguably it is going to make that a little bit more difficult. But seeing as how you're also doing things under loads, you're also doing things that are very short sprint oriented, or high power and short recovery. That's where things like creatine are going to be useful. Plus, that whole brain injuries that tends to happen in combat and also in contact sports and otherwise. That's why I would thoroughly suggest most folks, if they have the access to it, to use it. And it's also incredibly inexpensive. Creatine, compared to a lot of other proteins and potions and powders that are going to be out there that don't really have a lot of efficacy, that's the one for your dollar for effect is definitely in a pretty good setup for you. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when it comes to, the basics of the supplement industry, it's a kind of a cat and mouse game. It's not like the FDA approved all these things and now they can use it. Instead, the FDA has to kind of show that what you're doing is unsafe and is not derived from a plant, an animal, or anything else, and it's completely lab grown and unsafe. And because of that, you get a lot of folks that are out there. Right now, I'm quite sure we could Google multivitamin pack for the coronavirus, and there's probably a couple D-bags out there that are already trying to market effectively a multivitamin that's not really maybe of that high of quality of sources, just so they can make a couple dollars off of people's fears. And so you have to keep in mind, it's not like the pharmaceutical industry, which has more oversight, but also has some flaws to it that my wife and I got to have a fun conversation about on our walk earlier today, but I won't bother you guys with it unless you want to hear about some of the more important things of understanding about endocrinology and giving people appropriate medicines for how they react. And my wife's like, no, it was even boring for us to talk about. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the purity. That's why you want to look for things that have that third-party testing, like the stuff that we've got in the lab, where they're actually making sure that what's on the label matches what's in the bottle, seeing as how companies don't actually have to do that. And so it is important to keep that in mind, along with you'll see companies that put things on there like proprietary blend. And proprietary blend literally means that everything they're listing then on the ingredients It could be mostly, and it typically is, just maltodextrin sugar. So, and then they'll list off, 30, 40, sometimes even 50 different ingredients in there. And if you were to actually measure each of those ingredients out by volume, it would end up being like maybe a nanogram of insert this or insert that different ingredient. And everything you're taking, it's always important. Just like when we talk about nutrition and grams of protein, grams of carbohydrate, grams of fat, you need to know what your units are, and you need to make sure you understand what that dosage should be relative to your body mass. So, with creatine, it's usually about 30 milligrams per kilogram of body mass a day, I believe. And you can go higher than that, but that's usually what they say is kind of like what you need to have. And we're at 30 to 50, I think, milligrams per kilogram per day is what you're looking for chronically. So, for example, Miss Cotton's on the talk today, and turns out she is a much smaller human compared to Brent. And so I would not expect them to have to use the same amount of grams of creatine every day, the same amount of caffeine each day. Because the amount of caffeine that makes, Brent ready to go work out is also probably enough that Hannah needs to go and like sprint for an hour just to get her heart rate to finally seem to match, get her body to match the level of output that her heart's just giving her like a hummingbird at rest from doing that much amphetamine. So, keep that in mind. And another issue is a number of less than savory outfits have been known to contaminate their supplements on purpose with anabolic agents, SARMs, other types of effective, drugs in order to, really give people a big performance effect. And supposedly, a couple, Ultimate Orange was one that did this back in the day where their first run had Anavar in it. This is kind of an old wives' tale at this point because it's one of those things you can't really prove, but it checks out for most of the people I've been around. That what they did is by putting that oral anabolic in the first run of the pre-workout, all these people made incredible gains. They were making all this progress. So if you make all these great gains while you're on a supplement, you're probably gonna keep buying that supplement. And so what they did is the first run had that in there, but by the time they got to the second and third run, because they keep making new lots of it, they pulled the Anavar out of it. So whenever the FDA came to drug test it, it was no longer there. And also the people that were taking it weren't getting the same amount of gains as before, but they had already hooked them, and that allowed them to move forward for quite some time with it and make some money off it. So, it is important to be careful because, there's a lot of people out there that are trying to make money, and they're not always trying to do it in an ethical way. Because, to be fair, if you don't have ethics and morality, this world is your oyster, because you can do pretty much anything you want and never feel bad about it. But the rest of us, and thankfully most of us, have a little bit more of a different basic morality. So it's just important to just be aware. And then also when you have a friend or family member, I'm sure you guys, you at least know somebody on your social media that's trying to sell some type of supplements out of some pyramid scheme company out there multi-level marketing like Herbalife and otherwise, where it's like their products aren't that great, but boy howdy, they, get the one person to sell that then ends up selling to these other people. And, people are trying to find ways to make money, and they can be desperate, and it's preying upon folks that aren't comfortable. And that's really too bad, because there's a number of supplements like creatine, like caffeine, that are pretty darn useful in specific uses, but they can often get kind of the baby thrown out with the bathwater because everybody, enough of people are bad operators in the space. But I'm now in rant mode, not teach mode, so we're going to eject myself from that position. And instead, what questions do you guys have? Oh, fun little story while I'm waiting for hopefully someone to unmute themselves and get me to stop talking. We had a football player that he asked me about, have you heard of this thing called I think it's called Ostrain or MK2866? The supplement place was telling me I should take it to help me with my football. And Ostrain is a selective androgen receptor modulator, which is a SARM, which if you take that, it is illegal to utilize for both NCAA competition and WADA competition. So this bro at the supplement store, I couldn't tell you the name of the store, was trying to sell this college football player a drug that would definitely get him to fail a drug test because he didn't know any better. And, therein lies the problem is, once again, there's a whole lot to know out there, and there's people that are, trying to make that paper and not always realizing that, it's probably not the best to give a drug tested athlete something that'll cause them to fail a drug test.
I was going to ask you about SARMs.
Mm-hmm.
have they become so popular in like college athletics and pro athletes because it's like a shorter half-life? So like
So
you
that's
say
a good thing to keep in mind. And so when Jake says a shorter half-life, guys, drug tests, you can only test for the drug that's in the system or the metabolites of the drug in the system. So for example, an easy one for you guys to think about in your lives is alcohol. Every single one of you guys could literally be drinking all the way through my lecture. Now, if I then gave you a breath test at the end of the lecture, you'd all, show up with alcohol in your blood. And then obviously when it comes to drug testing for NCAA athletics, they consider you have, an ounce of insert this illegal drug in your system to you have like the amount that would kill a elephant in your system. Both of them, you fail the drug test, you're in trouble. Now, if we go back to the breathalyzer thing, you guys can be drinking and say you drink, we'll say you keep going all the way until, some late time tonight, like 7 or 8 o'clock, usually when I'm going to bed. And so you guys, if we breath test you at say midnight, some of you guys at that point might actually, blow clean because your body metabolizes that alcohol so quickly that you'd be fine. Where others of you guys, you might not be able to blow clean again until some point on Saturday morning, maybe even Saturday afternoon, if you're really slow metabolizer. Now, the key thing with that drug testing, like that Jake brought up with SARMs and testosterone, is for a number of sports, when you're going to be drug tested. So in all reality, and I am not saying to do this, but if you are a D1 athlete, now is the time to ride that roid pony into Swoleville as hard as you can, because you will not be drug tested for quite some time. So you can have a lot of spontaneous muscle growth and then cycle off the drugs, which, don't get me wrong, when you stop using the drugs, you do lose some of your gains, but you don't lose all of it. And so you could utilize a lot of these substances and be fine. Now, SARMs, I don't honestly know how fast they metabolize out of your system. There's been some CrossFit Games competitors that have been disqualified because they said it was because they were cross-contaminated by their romantic partner. So that's fascinating. There's been other athletes that have popped positive because they supposedly ate beef that was contaminated with one type of, like, I think it was like clenbuterol from like Mexican cows a couple of years ago. Like, and mind you, these are claims, so you're not quite sure if they're just trying to cover their butt or if they genuinely did it on accident. Because usually the two people that fail drug tests are the ones that honestly did not know that they were doing the drug in the first place, like it was a complete accident, and the ones that were too dumb to pass the drug test. Because as long as you know how long that drug takes to get through your system, all you got to do is time things appropriately, so that way when you do get tested, you're not going to have to worry about it. And so, yeah, with collegiate, with NCAA testing, that's how long of a heads up do they give you guys?
the 24-hour notice.
So there you go. If you're using a drug that effectively clears your body in 12 to 18 hours, you just know to skip a dose and you're good to go. But if you're taking a drug that takes like a week or two to clear your system, like you're kind of screwed. But even then, they're only doing your analysis. So you can always, and this is as uncomfortable as you'd think, reverse catheter yourself, fill yourself up with somebody else's drug-free urine, and then pee out their drug-free urine as quickly as possible after doing that, and then you pass the drug test and you don't have an issue. They refer to that colloquially as the oil change. And in fact, they even had for a while a male prosthesis called the Whizzinator that a gentleman would wear on top of himself in that area. And then whenever one of the NCAA individual, or it was one drug testing federation, is like, that's not actually a wang, that's plastic. And then that kind of, so that's why, I mean, I've been drug tested for powerlifting, and it's always a weird moment to literally be peeing while there is literally another person staring at the stream while you're doing it. It's very, well, I mean, do they do the same thing with you guys with the NCAA?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's different. And obviously there's been ladies that have been known to, shall we say, put urine in part of their anatomy. like in a baggie, and then, fill the cup that way, which, sorry, my wife's sitting over the couch in the other room, and her face is when I say these things. It's just nice to have someone who's saying something back to me, other than you, Jake. I really appreciate your contributions. So, yeah, it's the real problem. It is a real problem with sport, which is when you have such a huge financial, professional advantage, or not advantage, but incentive to do drugs in order to get to the next level. Like if my boss said, I can start abusing Adderall in order so I can be more productive with research, and it's not going to be the difference between the income I make right now and like you make 20 more percent. Like, I'm not going to run that much amphetamine because turns out heart attacks and strokes kind of run in my family. That's why I still do cardio, because I don't want to die stupid. But what's league minimum for professional baseball these days, Jake?
I mean, it just depends on if you're in the minor leagues or major leagues. But
No, I'm referring to major leagues.
I mean, I think it's like 100K, maybe. Maybe more. Maybe less. I don't know.
Okay, I'm pretty sure it's higher than that. I know, like professional basketball and professional football, we're talking closer to like
because
$1 million now.
It's different because MLB, you're technically still a rookie until you get 6 service years. It's really weird how they it's like that's for a whole nother day. Like,
okay, well, but here we'll say, just for the sake of argument, which it can be 100% wrong, we'll say just bare minimum true, like you're in the MLB, is like 120 grand a year.
Yeah.
And that doesn't involve all the other perks. Now, if you're playing just AA ball, AAA ball, how much are you really getting paid to do that?
Not that much. I mean, not
like 20, 30 grand?
Yeah, maybe less. There's some guys who make less.
Exactly. So if you tell me the difference between making my income right now and then making literally, 4, 5, maybe 10, 20x my current income, woo, honey, you better watch your Adderall sources, because I'm about to be blowing through that stuff so I can make us that paper. I only got to sacrifice my health for like 2 years and then I can retire. And by retire, I'm still going to teach, but I'm just never going to go to a single meeting ever again.
Speaking of making paper, if you need some Adderall, like you could just come to me.
Gracie, I am not about going into black market drug-seeking behaviors, but I appreciate the offer, but this is also being recorded, so I'm definitely going to say no to all of that. Now, but that's the thing to really keep in mind, guys, if there's just such a big incentive. If the difference between you guys, it's not the difference between you guys making, a good median household income of 50 grand, and then you making, you made 10 grand more a year and you're taking drugs that might legitimately shorten your life. Instead, it can often be the difference between, you going back to not possibly having that good of a job or good of a career. And I'm not trying to get into a big conversation about, the types of majors that college football players are pushed into, and otherwise to, playing professional football for, once again, I think league minimum is more like $300,000 or $400,000 a year, but that's a lot of money. And that's a lot of money. And if you're right on that cusp, I cannot, in good conscience, tell you drugs are bad, you shouldn't do that. And I can't also tell you, like, YOLO it, man, make that paper. Instead, that's something that individual needs to have a real deep conversation with themselves about, like, what do I want out of life? What risks am I willing to accept? What risks am I not willing to accept? Because you can already look at the data that, irregardless of drug use, your average NFL football player lifespan is, I think it's like at this point, almost 15 or 20 years shorter than the average American. And we know how great the average American isn't taking care of themselves. So by playing professional football, your life's going to be shorter. Now, that can be obviously due to a myriad of things, but okay, but you're making a lot more money and you're doing pretty good up until that point. So there's a lot of give and take there. And I at least want to say it's a conversation worth having, and not necessarily speaking in monologues and not letting the other side, tell you their thoughts, their opinions, and kind of their motivations. But I've obviously never been in the situation where I've had to do drugs in order to keep my job or to progress in my job. But if they ever started drug testing for caffeine, I already told you, a lot of my coworkers are getting fired the next day because there's no way they're ever passing a drug test for that stuff. Though I could make a lot of money selling my urine to them because I don't do coffee like it's a vitamin, getting close to a macronutrient. Any other questions about ergogenics that you guys would like me to go and talk about? Because I'm pretty comfortable both talking about the things that I, both have experience with being around, seeing individuals use it. With the anabolic steroids risk, you're going to see nearly the exact same risks when it comes to the side effects with selective androgen receptor mediators. But SARMs are, and thank you for bringing that up again, Jake, SARMs can be quite potentially a great avenue when they're more thoroughly developed, because the idea is it'll be selective. So the problem with if we go and, okay, so this is more for the gals on in the lecture today than us gentlemen. How many of you ladies, like your dad has got like just a massive, like thick, powerful beard? Nobody? All of your dads are just baby face and just have like a little bit of peach fuzz?
My dad has a mustache.
Nice. Now the question is, Gracie, do you want to have a mustache?
No, I do not.
Okay. So obviously, one of the big differences between, you and your dad is because you got 49% of your genetics from him. It just turns out you don't have the testosterone pushing the secondary sex characteristics. Now, I come from, I guess, part Wookiees because I am a pretty hairy individual. And how to say, my grandmother was an incredible woman. When she passed away, she had a legitimate like Fu Manchu goatee. Like, she's 100% Italian. Once again, just rocking the mustache. And that's okay. Now, if my grandmother also had a lot of androgens, then she would have had a lot thicker facial hair and a lot more facial hair. And the same thing about possibly deepening the voice and other secondary sex characteristics. Now, the key is, if you give someone testosterone, so, let's say, for example, and once again, I'm not saying anyone's going to do it, but, Gracie decides to go and ride that roid pony into Swoleville, and she comes back in the fall and is out squatting Sam and talking smack on her. And, she also has a nice, thick, full mustache. Turns out testosterone is going to not just increase her muscle mass, but it's going to give her the secondary sex characteristics. Now, if we could get the selective androgen receptor mediator, so it only works on the androgen receptor in her muscle cells, in her bone cells, in her connective tissue cells or tendons and ligaments, well, she might once again come back with that same increased muscle mass and performance abilities. However, she's not going to have the deeper voice, the facial hair, and the other secondary sex characteristics that you see due to testosterone use. So if/when SARMs are developed well enough that they really do work like testosterone, but only on muscle and tendon, bone, effectively, what we're looking at for performance metrics, I want to give that to my mother because she is getting close to 70. Her muscle mass is not great. Her bone mass and strength is probably not great. And so if I can give her a drug that gives her the performance advantages of testosterone without the androgenized effects of testosterone, I'm going to do it because that's going to be useful. But right now, those drugs are still very much so under pharmaceutical research. And the ones that you can find on the market, which are sold quasi-legally, really illegally, those are the ones that often were dropped by big pharma because they had too many side effects. And the same thing is true with pro-hormones, only pro-hormones are even worse because those are being converted into testosterone, and that's hard on your liver in the first place. And second of all, the ones that are still somewhat legal are the ones that have the greatest amount of side effects with the least amount of positive effects. because the ones that initially had the lowest amount of side effects and the greatest amount of positive effects, those have all become illegal. Yeah, so don't do drugs unless you really know what you're doing. No, even then, it's once again, it's being intense with what you're doing. I've got friends that are, big time power lifters, bodybuilders, that they do copious amounts of substances with the goal of trying to be as big and strong as possible. And they've had, like, yeah, I know I'm not going to live as long. Like I figure I'm going to cut off at least a decade or two off my lifespan, but this is what I want to do. And you know what? They're adults. They're in their 30s, they know what they want to do, but it's, when you got some teenager to early 20s individual that's never really trained hard, had a good diet, and then they go straight to these substances that are very potent, that's when, it's like, hold up, let's see what your body can give you first. And then if you really have the why, then we can maybe talk about the how. But if you don't have the why, no, the how is, there's no how for you. You don't need to be doing this stuff. Any other questions, comments, concerns before you guys, prep yourself to do 3 minutes of as many burpees as you can?
I got one more.
Yeah.
So this may be just because some of my teammates are just dumb, but so they said there's research out about BCAAs, and like basically if you are drinking the night before or something like that, and you drink enough where you're going to get a hangover, that if you drink BCAAs, you won't wake up with a hangover. So is that true that BCAAs prevent or help hangovers? Like I said, some of my teammates aren't the brightest.
No. It's not that they're not the brightest. Have you ever heard of what's known as misattribution error?
No.
Okay, and this is a really good one. Just kind of thinking, keep in mind, we all have our biases. I guess I'm not going to talk about my dislikes of certain hair colors while I'm presenting, since I'm recording. It's obviously said tongue in cheek. The key is, if you know you're going to be hungover in the first place, and you're probably just drinking something in general, plus most of your BCAA supplements are probably going to have some, a little bit of electrolytes in there, maybe a little sodium, a little potassium, maybe some magnesium, that in turn is going to help more with the hangover than the BCAAs ever were. Part of it is due to the cognitors and things that you just haven't metabolized out of your system, and the other part just due to issues with hydration. So in reality, for these individuals, you should simply say this: do a true scientific study. Do the same bombing yourself out with the exact same amount of alcohol. Lord knows, with this time of day or this time of year, there's not as much to do. And then one night, don't do branched chain amino acids. Just do the powder with no extra fluid. Another night, do the powder with the fluid. And then another night, just do the fluid. And then the third night, just put a little salt in your water and then drink that. And then compare your hangovers between all four of those settings. And if you get enough of them, because it sounds like it's a number of the gentlemen on your team, to run the experiment, then you can get some real results and be like, okay, here's what really seems to shake. Because it's probably more a function of the dehydration, and they're thinking it's this. And that's, one of those issues of where different people are like, oh my God, it's this, I've been taking this pre-workout, it must be the acetyl L-Carnitine, or it's the 500 milligrams of caffeine you did, and that's really what's bolstering up your performance. So just being mindful that, we all make our mistakes all the time. We have confirmation bias. You see a lot of stuff right now these days. Don't get me wrong, the pandemic is awful, and we are doing, correct things. I think there's, like anything, there's the truth in the center. And there's some people that think, oh, whatever, it's not that big of a deal, we're fine. And I'm going to say that they're wrong. But then there's also the one of like, oh shit, we're all gonna die, panic and hide and buy all the toilet paper. It's like, it's not that bad. Now, it is very bad for very specific populations, which is not a small slice of this country, much less this planet, which hence why trying to flatten the curve, but not necessarily completely remove the curve. And there's a number of other really interesting nuanced conversations. But that's where you have to go and avoid being in the echo chamber, which is where people just say the same thing you want to hear over and over again, and play into your own confirmation biases. Like, well, so-and-so, they did their thing and it's fine and no one's died. Like, well, you got to wait 2 weeks to see what happens there, buddy. And then, the people in their bunker where it's like, you could probably go say hi to other human beings with appropriate social distancing. And it is difficult there. Does that make sense, kind of explaining misattribution error? And
Yeah.
yes, because we all have ours. And well, you guys, now that a lot of you guys are pretty much all you guys back home with your parents or your family. Is anybody still kind of living on their own?
Yeah.
So Brent, are you in an apartment by yourself, or do you got anybody else there living with you?
Yeah, I'm still in my apartment in Richmond.
By yourself, or do you got a roommate?
Yeah, my girlfriend's my roommate, so.
Ooh, is she in the room?
Yes.
Okay, then we will not go down this line of questioning. So the rest of you guys that are back home with your parents, how many of you guys know what your parents' biases are? Like, you're like, oh, because they're going to say it's this. And it's not necessarily about like the pandemic. It can be other things where it's like, no matter what, my mom's always going to say this or my dad's going to say this. You just simply know that's how they're going to react in a way that is legitimately logical, like it's not correct, because they have their own biases built in. Because I'm recording this, so I'm not going to say it out loud, but my wife and I both know the biases that our own sets of parents have, which we love them and we want them to stay safe. But at the same time, it's easy to see biases in others, but it's very difficult to see our own. And that's why, I don't know if any of you guys ever noticed, I have the Richard Feynman quote on my wall in front of my office, so I see it every day, which is, be careful not to fool yourself, because you're the easiest person to fool. So I think that might be a decent note to end on, unless you guys have any other questions. And otherwise, be safe out there, take care of yourselves, and I will start writing up that lab and get that posted hopefully early next week, and then kind of have the Google Doc that you guys can all link over to.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up, Gracie?
So, for the lab this week, lab 13, I'm trying to do the R, find the R, and in Excel, I made the graph. And do I make the graph by using like X as my the load and then my Y as the velocity?
So you can definitely do that. Let me go ahead and I'll pull up some stuff. Okay, so here's how I keep my diary. It's a giant Excel document. It's really boring. Okay, so let's just say this is percent and this is speed. So, we got 30, 40, 50, and then I can go ahead and we're not going to 110%. And we'll say that's 1.2, 1.1, 1, 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, and then actually this should probably be more like 0.3, and that should be more like 0.5, 0.7. So that way there'll be kind of a kink in the line, so it won't be perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and go insert, scatter plot. Then I'm going to go ahead and select data, chart data range. So I'm going to click here, select all this. So horizontal, notice is going to be percentage, and the other is going to be my speed. So now that I've got this here, I'm going to go ahead, add trend line. It's going to be linear with displaying the equation and displaying my R value. So now I'm going to go and click out, close you. And so now you can see my value and you can see how it's got our relationship here. And that's really all you're going to be doing. And that'll be the numbers you're writing in. And you can think, instead of go Y, well, Y right here is going to be equal to the velocity. And then X is going to be equal to the percentage of 1RM. So does that make sense how you would kind of rewrite that with how you put that into your sheet?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the R squared value,
Mhm.
does that stand for the R on our sheet?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So R squared is literally just R multiplied by R.
Yeah, okay.
So that's effectively the amount of explained variance through the Pearson product correlation. And so hence in this particular model of completely made up data, you are going to see that as obviously the percent of 1 RM goes up, the speed declines, and that about 97% of that difference is simply explained of how the velocity changes in a movement with how much weight you're lifting.
Okay. Okay, that's all.
All right, guys. So, keep staying safe out there. Feel free to shoot me an email if you guys have got questions, comments, concerns. Brent, I was not trying to walk you into a minefield there. My apologies if things get a little cold for a little bit. I'm kidding. But yeah, be safe out there, guys, and have a great day. I will talk with you guys on Monday. And really at this point, it's just going to be a lot of reviewing until the semester's over and exploring some of those things. I think on Monday, I'm really just going to try to spend the entire time breaking down the performance of the Doom guy for you guys for kind of that extra credit for fun thing, which I personally obviously find interesting. You guys might not, but that's okay. Be safe. Have a great one.